and welcome to Varn blog. And today we are talking with Andres Bernal, who is a lot of things, actually. You're an economic policy advisor to the mayoral candidate, Dianne Morales, correct?
Correct.
You're a former economic policy advisor for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, correct?
Correct. Yep.
All right.
2019 campaign.
You are affiliated with the New School and heterodox policy studies and urban economics.
So I teach in an urban studies department at CUNY Queens College, and finishing my doctorate at the New School in policy, which I approach from a heterodox perspective.
Cool. And let's see. And I'm trying to think of everything I need to get on. And you are an associate editor of Money for Money on the Left, the journal, right? Yeah.
It's a collective. It's a media collective. We're putting together a journal. We have kind of a media publication that we were calling a vertical, and 2 podcasts at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And that's associated vaguely with Monthly Review, and also, is it associated with anything else?
Yeah, it's associated with Monthly Review, and it's kind of part of the broader MMT ecosystem, which will have some more cool things coming up throughout the summer that we're going to be releasing, some new organizations and stuff like that. So, we're going to be doing more formal advocacy work through a 501c4 that'll be executive director of, called Public Money Action, around a jobs guarantee in the United States and some other kind of important policy things. And then think tank we're putting together. So stuff like that. And of course, there's a Modern Money Network, which is kind of a student organization that puts together a yearly conference and educates and does all this stuff on MMT.
Right. So I vaguely associate you with the MMT humanities people, which confuses most people because they're like, why would monetary theory have a humanities department? And I roll my eyes a little bit because I'm like, well, Marxists do, so I don't know. like MMT is not the only one. But one of the things I've been interested in is this distinction of left MMT in particular, because I think it's a little unclear why there is no one claims to be right MMT, but we all know there is one. Well, we all know who follow MMT circles know there is a right adjacent MMT, which would still be on the broad spectrum U.S. left. A center MMT and a left MMT. So what distinguishes left MMT from the other two tendencies?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think some of the lack of clarity there is because MMT is relatively a young body of work to begin with. And when I kind of got into the space, it had already been cohering into a kind of a movement that I really feel like I've jumped into. And the Modern Money Network has been a very important organization in that. And I've kind of always seen that, and it's always been an overtly progressive project. But with that said, they're not as nearly as influential. I guess we call it a conservative MMT. But throughout my time in these spaces, I've noticed that, particularly in Europe, actually, to be honest, there are tendencies that kind of do an MMT but with social conservative positions type of trend.
Yeah, there's a nationalist-y form of MMT in Europe that actually sees itself also as a little bit more copacetic to Marxism than left MMT. Although the form of Marxism it's copacetic with also makes a lot of Marxists uncomfortable. So it's
yeah, yeah. So that's kind of weird and interesting. But I mean, what began to happen, I think, is that from the humanities, the cultural studies, and the critical theory world, especially the work Scott Ferguson was doing, and what has emerged around that, wanted to be more explicit about certain openly anti-fascist work and and social and critical theory that was unpacking, many of the limits or the problems or the tendencies that we see as leading towards reactionary outcomes or analyses. And that's what left MMT is, right? So it is kind of, on one hand, this position that is just openly saying, like, we are leftists, we are seeking reactionary tendencies, including when we see them in people who claim to be MMTers. And there's kind of like the methodological point, I think, is important as well in left MMT, which is, being open about the importance of social and critical theory in this work, so that it's not, which, there's obviously an important place to do, like, just the economic stuff. There's a lot of great legal scholarship in the MMT world as well. But when I came into it, something that I felt was a bit lacking was this social theory and critical theory part of things, and that's kind of like what left MMT has taken up. And that's because a lot of my background also in my undergraduate studies was in critical theory, and that was the part of philosophy and politics that spoke to me the most. So yeah, left MMT, the political positioning kind of in this historical moment that we've been living, and the methodological approach to what MMT is used for as a framework.
So what I have seen as far as the critical theory approach, and I've been reading and following you guys as best I can. I started, MMT first came on my radar around discussions of Grexit, and actually it was framed to me with people who would no longer be considered MMTers. So these are Minsky people, people around Steve Keen, who are not, like, their difference with MMT is obscure to even some MMTers, because I've gone through and it seems like, so you disagree about what we should say something is, basically. But that I don't want to lose our audience getting into that rabbit hole. But I had worried initially, and my main critique of modern monetary theory have been its neo-chartalist assumptions were methodologically nationalistic. And concurrent to, I guess, the Kilton book kicking off, and then Scott Ferguson's work, I started seeing people within the MMT community start questioning the nationalistic methodology and assumptions. Like, what could this kind of legal interdependency be that isn't, let's say, necessarily focused around nation states, and specifically focused around the most developed nation states in the Anglosphere. The criticisms of MMT from Marxists that I have listened to that I think aren't, to be vulgar, dumb, have mostly gone around this point. The other criticisms, I think most MMTers can kind of shrug off, and I'm not going to recount all of them. For people have listened to me debate MMTers before, but so I was interested in seeing that this critical theory core that these left MMTers were bringing, like yourself, like most of the superstructure peeps, Will and Max, they were also beginning to try to figure out how you would talk about this and how to conceptualize this around a legal framework. Concurrently, I think my memory just blanked. Dr. Katoub,
Fidel Kaboub?
Yeah, Kaboub. Yes, thank you. Started working on this in regards to specifically North Africa, which which also my critiques of MMT priorly have been around my experience of the attempt to float the currency in Egypt. And I started seeing work done there. So first, let's talk about the general framework, because people who aren't watching this probably can't tell. Maybe they can tell by your name, but you obviously have concerns outside of the U.S. So, and you were one of the first people I knew on Twitter talking about like having to reconceive policy and legal frameworks so that countries in Latin America would not be forced, not even by necessarily bad trade agreements, just by trying to, have access to U.S. markets, to peg their currency to the dollar, and that's what have access to MMT policies. Now, you were doing this in tweets, so you weren't spelling out specific policies, because how do you do that in 200 characters? But you were one of the people I saw talking about this, and I had frankly not heard a lot about that prior to you and a few other people working in this field. So why do you think that's important? And, what's the theoretical framework for that?
Cool. Yeah. I mean, well, so for me, I'm Colombian, was born in Colombia, came here when I was 3 or 4, was very much raised around a, leftist internationalist environment. My father was involved in the student protests in Colombia at the Universidad Nacional during the time of a lot of both militancy on the left and also a very repressive response from the government at the time, which we're still seeing the fallout to this day, in the late 70s, early 80s. So I've always kind of had in mind, obviously, the importance of what's going on in my own country in Colombia and connecting this to international issues, and not really, concerning myself with only what the U.S. does, and also, thinking about how what the U.S. does and is doing implicates and impacts the rest of the world. So, to set some context, that's kind of like where I was coming from. I mean, why is that important? Is just it's absolutely critical. One, because politically, I think it's essential to have an internationalist perspective, because you can't, one of the I guess the principles that not just left MMTers, but many on the left obviously have, is that we are all part of systems that can't be isolated, or understood as isolated, and having nothing to do with all these interconnected institutions and economic and political dynamics and whatnot. So that's kind of one thing. I guess because I came into the conversation from that mindset to begin with, maybe some of the insights that I was taking about MMT early on were different from people that may have come in with a nationalist perspective from the beginning. So, to me, breaking down money as not in questioning, disrupting this idea that money comes from barter, and that it is, a finite representation of some kind of grounded value or something like that. Like deconstructing that and opening that up immediately opened up my perspective on what this means for Colombia, global South countries, and the world at large. And then the other, I think, important piece is this kind of relationship between acceptability and credit. And so, like, from MMT 101, if you're thinking about what's happening in the United States, or it's kind of like, all right, well, the dollar and the U.S. government has, kind of political monopoly over that, and they're the ones that accept the taxes. We all know that story, et cetera, et cetera. But thinking about how there's layers to these levels of acceptability. And if you're if you pay attention to some of the work happening in terms of complementary currencies and local currencies, and Scott Ferguson's work and others' work on the unis, and the relationship between the Federal Reserve and the issuance of unis from universities that can serve like a form of credit as well. All of these different layers of acceptability, obligations, right? Like open up the a different way to think about the role of money in a global economy. It brings attention to questions raised by Keynes and others after the Second World War about kind of creating not just a global currency, but figuring out how to stabilize the world economy in some way or another, right? So all of that is important. The framework that a left MMT approach would take for the global South is one that first, I think, rejects a lot of the assumptions that we've been talking about. So something I hear a lot is, well, MMT only makes sense for the US because it's the reserve currency. And I've never I feel like that's just a script that people really like and don't really it almost seems as though there is some. It's very much a fetishization of money, and this idea that because it's a reserve currency, there is like some magical thing going on that gives it special powers. I don't think it's that simple. And when like quality of life in Britain, for example, for more people has increased as the pound is no longer the reserve currency. So I was kind of interested in well, what does that mean when a country is a reserve currency? And, thinking about, all right, well, what we're really talking about here is that a lot of countries like to sell things or import things to, or export, I should say, send things over and export them to the United States. And so, we buy stuff in dollars, and so they want dollars, right? And not to take that as some metaphysical economic law, but rather try to break down the dynamics of what these things mean. And second of all, whether a country or a few countries have reserve currencies or not does not mean that a country in the global South therefore has no capacity to do something with their currency whatsoever. And so being Colombian, and following Colombian politics every year, and as every presidential election approaches, there are debates over what's possible and what the left should propose. And most of the time, very neoclassical, neoliberal, quote unquote experts reject any left proposition on these monetary grounds of it being either too expensive, or there's not enough money, or we're not the reserve currency. And there's a lot of space that can do a lot of politically important things, meaningfully impact people's lives that don't equate to having US level of monetary capacity, but are nonetheless very, very important. So that distinction to me is very critical as well. So the framework goes in kind of acknowledging that there is a spectrum of monetary capacity or agency. And many MMTers call this monetary sovereignty. Some on the left, people on the left MMT world are uncomfortable with this, the baggage that comes with the term sovereignty. And we've seen Will Beeman's essay critique the idea of sovereignty and talk about money beyond sovereignty, et cetera. But really the idea here is that there's a spectrum of monetary agency or capacity that different nations have. Obviously, the European Union nations gave up theirs entirely, and there's questions here about what policy the European Monetary Union is doing or not doing, and the fact that there's no really sense of a fiscal policy there, and those problems. And then there are countries in the global South who have their own currency, taxed in their own currency, and some of them fix their currency to the dollar or to something else. And MMTers would say that's already starting to limit their capacity to use monetary agency. And then the other out of four, so your own currency, you tax in it. Do you float your currency or do you peg it to something? And then the last one is your debt in your own currency or not? And for many countries in the global South, their debt, or their bond sales to be more exact, is in another currency. So breaking down what that consists of and what is the process that is leading to this dependency on issuing bonds and buying bonds in another currency and being indebted in another currency is what's important from like a structural analysis perspective. So as a framework, that's what MMT is doing. And so to start off, I mean, I think it's just really important to operate through that framework from the get-go. It's really not about, and I don't know why people have this impulse to want to make it about, can you do MMT or not, right? And kind of missing out that what's important here is like the framework of the analysis is what's important. And it's not trying to say that like every country can just do whatever, or that every country has the same capacity that the United States might have, but using the framework to break down what are the differences and why do they exist, and then that being what we can guide our analysis with, our political analysis, our struggle, and also how we do policy. So that's kind of like the setup to how you apply MMT to a developing world context, right? Global South. So thinking about where is this foreign debt coming from? Why does it exist? What are the structural dynamics at play behind this? And what would it mean to begin to cultivate an alternative to that situation?
So a few things that come out of that in my mind pretty much immediately. I think that a lot of these questions of spectrum seem to have been something that bubbled up from the problems of Greece 10 years ago, because the first instantiations of MMT tried to have like a binary on-off switch about, what Syriza should do. Should it like Grexit, go full independent currency, or should it accept the deals of the Troika? Now, Greece is not really a developing world country, but it's also not. I don't know. Do you have what do you think was learned from that period, and why do you think the spectrum of monetary agency is so important?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the question of how we do a structural analysis and what we pay attention to. And time again, I hear people on the left making the same mistakes and the same claims that you will hear from like neoclassical and mainstream economists, even Marxists sometimes. I mean, just as an anecdote, in Mexico, I think for a hot minute, I'm not sure if she's still there, but a Marxist was at the Ministry of Finance, advocating for the same kind of austerity that AMLO has been putting forward as a way to like finance basic government expenditures. So you hear this a lot, and during that whole Greek debacle, I mean, I think the kind of the whole left, and MMT hadn't really gone mainstream very much at that point, but yeah, so many mistakes were being made in thinking that just the very basic idea that Greece did not have its own currency and that there were structural limits that we had to pay attention to in that analysis were being totally ignored. So, and in the United States around that time, you would hear constantly that any kind of public employment or expenditures for Medicare for all, et cetera, all of these things were going to turn us into Greece. I mean, the whole world was talking about how everybody was going to become Greece, with very little understanding of like what is actually the context around Greece. So lessons learned, I mean, to pay attention to the role of money and the role of whether or not you have, where you fall on this kind of spectrum, and paying attention to a structural analysis of that. And so, I mean, I've said that a few times. So what does that mean? I mean, in what capacity does your country have? What is your employment situation? What does your trade situation look like? And how should political struggles be mobilized to either change that, or so in one sense, I think struggling and mobilizing politically to change certain deals, challenge them, rearrange them, etc. And at the same time, kind of the generative role of using your capacity if you have your own currency. So this would be kind of like, Greece leaving the EU and investing it in public employment through a job guarantee and other projects that can build some of the domestic capacity that you may need to not be completely dependent on importing everything that is considered quote unquote high value added or whatnot from the rest of the world. So, instead of letting people go homeless, starve, and just wither in unemployment, actually mobilizing to address that. And that's not going to solve everything, but that is a very, very vital step to start to take if you are a country in the global south, or if you're going through a crisis like Greece and Spain did at the time.
So one specific policy answer I saw given, which I thought was somewhat strange given how we normally feel about cryptocurrency, was an MMTer who proposed an international alternative currency to pay debts in, and then a local currency for Greece, and I'm speaking specifically for Greece here, for Greece, if they were to attempt to get more political autonomy back. I started getting interested in these schemes. Some of them actually remind me of some of the weirder parts of the late Soviet Union's monetary schemes, where you had basically three completely different money markets that were only vaguely related. So you had one internationally, one between firms, and then one for individuals. Part of why, as a side note from the Marxist nerds out there, part of why state capitalism theory doesn't cleanly work with the USSR is their monetary scheme was bizarre. But it did get me thinking about different ways where you could kind of what the spectrum could mean as far as like sharing political autonomy and monetary autonomy, but being able to block production in a way where you're not like blacklisted by all the people with all the minerals to do these things that you could do otherwise. I mean, Greece has people. It's not without technology. So the issue becomes like, okay, can it get enough of these raw materials? Greece can't produce a lot of them, but is there a way where we can still deal in something that maybe the other countries would trust more than, a completely independent lira of a non-productive country, but generate our own economy so that our lira would eventually be able to have the productive capacity behind it to, effectively operate on a global market. And that's when I was like, oh, there really is a spectrum here. Would you like to maybe go into some specific policies for the global south that could be used in this way? Because there's a lot of different possible ways to approach this.
Yeah, so I think one of the important conceptual insights that MMT really made clear for me is that thinking of capital and markets and the economy at large as outside and independent of the state, of states in general, and of kind of public power is kind of like it's totally misleading and not accurate. And the tendency to kind of see global markets and markets in general as like doing their own thing can be really contested and brought out or exposed to the different ways that public legal entities are constructing all of that all the time. And there's like no way out of that. So both money and markets are constantly being designed and structured via law and other political processes. So they're kind of like not operating on their own outside of that. So that I think that's a really important perspective to keep in mind for all of this. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm one to see the kind of gradual process, obviously through a lot of political struggle, and none of this is easy by any means, to, in the global South, begin to massively mobilize in like three areas. I think in a just food production, I think is really important. A sustainable just food production. Sustainable energy is another key one. So many countries in the global South will export like crude oil and then buy it imported, from the global North at a much higher cost. So many countries in the global South, especially in the pink tide in Latin America, got into trouble for depending on the fossil fuel economy for their leftist projects. And that's a dead end. So another big one is massively investing in renewable energy and in kind of the qualitative dimension of consumption and production as well. So that would be two. And then three, in technology, so that if you're in the global South, you don't have to be importing microchips and all the technological things to make you a technologically advanced society and whatnot. So I was just talking about it's kind of cool because I was hanging out with my cousins, and they're in their early 20s, late teens, and they were asking me all these questions. And they just came to the United States from Colombia recently. So they're asking me all these questions, and it's just great because they were like, well, that means we need to educate our people to be able to produce some of this technology and understand it and have the capacity, the system's capacity to build out all this infrastructure. And it's like, yeah, let's start building some universities and investing in like these various forms of knowledge. Which, I don't want to be the guy that's just like, well, just STEM matters or anything like that. Just so yeah, the kind of STEM research is important, but all the different levels of and areas of education are pretty vital for all of this as well. And to be able to do it, I think, in an intersectional kind of socially just-minded way, to study science in that way as well, right? A culturally competent approach to that kind of stuff. So, and this is something that many on the left in Latin America have already been proposing, even without a knowledge of MMT, that's what they need to do. So, if you're going to have a just food system, if you're going to be investing in renewable energy and whatnot, that will inevitably lead to questions about land ownership and land distribution and that sort of thing. And that is absolutely huge in the global South, especially in Latin America. So we will fall into that problem as well. So the policies around that, I think, would do a lot of good. And if they are all coupled with public employment, and if you do that, because even if you are a developing country in the global South, you do have the capacity to spend on your unemployed, on your underemployed, and invest in what you do have access to. And so the more you do that, the less you are dependent on these other kind of global markets and whatnot. It's not like that's going to happen from one day to another, but it's not going to collapse anything either. Now, the question here, I think, comes up is like, what happens when people in the international community try to sabotage you, and and then you face some the potentials for some actual capital flight, which makes a lot more sense for a country or a region of the world that's been colonized, that faces imperialism, etc., than it does for the United States. I have very little worry, if any whatsoever, that the U.S. faces the prospect of an actual effective capital flight. Like nobody's gonna put all their workers and factories in their pocket and then get on a plane to somewhere else. It's not going to happen. But in countries where the development of factories and a lot of the employment and infrastructure and whatnot is directly coming and dependent on foreign investors, you might have more of a problem. So, I think that there's questions here on how to be strategic with capital controls. Venezuela fucked up when they pegged their currency and then allowed a black market dollar, a black dollar market to emerge, and that messed a lot of things up over there, which is another reason why it's important to float your currency. But yeah, conversations about capital controls are key in this point. And some people, some post-Keynesians will conflate pegging your currency with capital controls. And these are some of the technical levels of things that I don't fully like have an expertise on. Like you'd have to talk to somebody like Nathan Tankus about this. But I've seen kind of some left Keynesians conflate capital controls with pegging your currency. And MMTers have kind of been pushing back on this and saying like, no, you can float your currency and still do capital controls. They're not the same thing. And that's an important distinction to make. With that said, I mean, that's also where in this process of struggle and developing new institutions and investing in new initiatives, you need a regional movement, a regional leftist movement to start to form coalitions that have, in my opinion, more leverage to start to demand different things from the world. I mean, and I've heard people say like, all right, well, if U.S. investors are going to start fucking around with this, I mean, Latin America can start to make deals with China, or at least threaten to start to make more trade deals with China or other parts of the world. So, developing that regional alliance to at least be able to enter some of these negotiations and the setting of some of these deals and trade deals and designs in ways that are less exploitative, progressively less exploitative, are important. And then obviously our struggles here in the global north in the United States to push our governments to radically change policy, foreign policy and otherwise would be really important too. I mean, if we successfully pressure the development of green technologies that open up intellectual property rights and open source them as part of a reparations agenda, that would have a very meaningful impact on the global south and their ability to scale up renewable energy. If we also pressure our Federal Reserve or even the World Bank or whatnot to start issuing swap lines, which are this like really fascinating thing where instead of currency exchanges having to depend on markets or being volatile to interest rate policy or things like that, you can just basically directly buy the currency that a country needs in ways that don't create these super volatile relationships and dependencies. And it's what the United States did. The United States issued a bunch of the Fed issued a bunch of swap lines after the 2008 financial crisis to a bunch of European banks who were, and we saved everybody's ass with this stuff. And so, but we don't use these tools and these tricks when it really matters for countries that have experienced imperialism and whatnot. But the tools are there. But again, like I think this brings back attention to the fact that this part of politics involves decisions about debts and obligations, and they're not just grounded in economic laws that are totalizing, but they are part of like governing and governance. And even though the people in power are obviously a bunch of psychopaths often, there is the ability to redesign many of these things and at least pressure and change what these relationships and dynamics look like.
This brings me to a couple other key things that come up when I think about this in regards to what we could do in the U.S. For example, I tend to have a dual mindset on revolution and reform, and reform to me is actually part of the latter, believe it or not. I don't think you can do one without the other. But one of the things I think of is framing classical anti-imperialism as just transition to a multipolar world is a big thing. And part of that is forgiveness of debts. And even to the point of why MMT is important at home, or any kind of left monetary policy would be important at home, before you radically changed the government and rewrote the Constitution so we could just expropriate things, you would have to compensate people who hold some of those debts if they're private debts. But that's not all that hard to do if you are willing to put more liquidity in the economy, particularly if we can take it without inflation. But even with a little inflation, I'm not particularly worried. Making debt holders a little financially less viable doesn't make me sad at the moment. So to me, this points out how interrelated both domestic policy and foreign policy would be on this. Those swap lines is another instance of this, where we've used them strategically, but only for rich countries. We've never done them. And if the United States is really worried about the geopolitical position of China, and I don't wish to encourage any undue competition between us as nations. In fact, I am both U.S. and China skeptical because they're major nations, but I would want for the world normalization of those relations as best as possible. A policy of cooperation in these areas instead of like what we see with AFRICOM, because if it's more competitive and if it's a great game kind of competition, not only is the U.S. unlikely to win that given current trajectories, it's also likely to be resource expending in a way that frankly under current environmental conditions we really can't afford. And so I think MMT's push on thinking about this in the left MMT specific, because there are a lot of MMT books that are neutral on these environmental issues or whatever, but focusing on this in ways of developing green technologies, shifting industrial infrastructure worldwide, allowing for regional cooperative frameworks to happen so that they don't have to be highly competitive. That's all great, and I think actually as policy it's all good. I also think though that when people talk about this as an easy reform, and I actually don't think left MMTers do, but I do know a lot of like people who don't really understand the geopolitics or the economics get a glint in their eye and they're like, we can just print money and fix everything. And I worry that they are not thinking about how all this is interconnected, and these policies have to be fine-tuned. What do you have to say about that general need to fine-tune?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's something exhilarating, especially when you first kind of discover that you can issue money and spend and invest without having to like dollar for dollar find it from somewhere. And for people that on the left or progressives who are burnt out or have become cynical or whatnot, it's very motivating to be like, this is something new, it's different, it's fresh, and it's very powerful to be like, all right, fuck this, we're gonna start just paying people to do a bunch of awesome shit. So I think like that's where some of that gleam in the eye comes from at times. Look, I mean, I think like you don't have to perfectly fine tune everything before starting to, one, give everybody a good job to do something environmentally and socially useful in their nation. And I would even say that by doing some of these things, for countries in the global north that don't have, I guess we're the only one that don't have universal health care and higher education and whatnot, doing that, which MMT is very, very important to do it right, because talking about raising revenue does nothing to address whether or not you have the capacity to actually have Medicare for all, which was my big critique of, Bernie's position on this stuff. Because, well, I mean, I have two of them, and I think it's kind of relevant for the conversation. I mean, one is like, you really pull your hair out with how much political energy is spent trying to find out how you're going to pay for it. And even if you're like, we're going to tax the rich or whatever, that's not doing shit to really answer the inflation question, and even asking the question of whether Medicare for all would be deflationary, which it would be, because you get rid of like the private insurance industry and all of these middle managers and all these people who were part of the private insurance infrastructure. You don't need them anymore. And so you got to employ them in something else. But that's like a structural question you need to think about. And we didn't do any of that when talking about Medicare for all. And then my second critique of that was that particular communities, especially in the United States, Black communities, indigenous communities, et cetera, when you're talking about healthcare for everybody, you have to, as part of your politics, design and make sure you articulate a vision about healthcare that addresses the particular needs of the Black community, et cetera. And that didn't happen. So this is all to say that I think that doing this, whether it's in Colombia right now with a public jobs initiative or a job guarantee that can transition to peace from the very shitty situation that we've had for such a long time, and address some of this unemployment and poverty crisis we have. It might not likely to not completely solve it, obviously, but it will do a lot of meaningful good. So whether in a country like Colombia or in the United States, I would argue that starting to invest in these agendas and initiatives will make it more likely that we begin to take seriously the design of the impact on these international things. That was a long-winded way to say that.
So this brings up two things, but I'm going to start with, maybe what I put in the title of the program first. In Colombia, there has been an accelerating, let's say, I'm trying to figure out my term of art here. Let's just say a bunch of violence and general shitstormery with strikes and riots and whatnot because of the attempt to impose austerity taxation again. Would you like to go into the specifics of what's going on there? And maybe we'll just start with that.
So, yeah. So to understand what's happening in Colombia right now with austerity and what's happening, I think you really have to go back. Well, I mean, we can go back to the 40s or to the independence, but the modern political context kind of starts throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s. So, throughout the 90s, we're kind of in this crisis with the war on drugs and narco-terrorism and Pablo Escobar and all of that thing. And on top of that, the FARC, kind of leading their Stalinist revolution. And they lose the vast majority of popular support in the country because they decided to strategically use kidnappings in their efforts. Anyways, that all leads for the growth of a far right, a very paramilitarized far right in Colombia. And one of the leader of this is Álvaro Uribe. And he is a senator, I believe, at the time. And for some time, he's the governor of Antioquia, which is a major part of the country, major state. And he leads a number of privatization efforts in the country, basically turns our healthcare system into the U.S. model, pension systems, all of that, kind of saying, look, this is what the United States is doing. We should copy them because they figured it out, sort of thing. This is all going in opposition to the new constitution that Colombia set up in the early 90s that is actually quite progressive. So anyways, this is all happening, and he runs for president in 2002 through a war on terror type of campaign. And this is right after 9/11 and during a time where we're about to go into war in Iraq. So Uribe takes all of George W. Bush's talking points and the war on terror talking points and really builds this movement behind him that he's going to make Colombia safe through law and order and basically killing every single one of the FARC members. So throughout the 2000s, a lot of people get duped into thinking that Colombia got safer, when in reality, a bunch of human rights abuses are happening throughout the country. The most notable one is the scandal called falsos positivos, or false positives, where under Uribe's watch, generals were pressuring the army to build up quotas of FARC killings by going into villages, finding poor people, even disabled people, killing them, telling them they're going to get a job, murdering them, dressing them up as FARC soldiers, and reporting them as killings. And thousands of people experienced this. And it then went out that, it got exposed in the media. And this was a huge scandal. And people went to prison for their involvement in this, for the way that people in the Colombian Congress had ties to paramilitary groups. The state got paramilitarized, basically. And the consequences were pretty devastating. But people were still buying it. I mean, Colombia got really radicalized towards the right wing for a hot minute there. So Uribe picks Santos, who was his defense minister, to be like the next guy. But Santos comes from like an oligarchic family that is liberal-ish, not far right. So Santos betrays Uribe and pursues a more moderate agenda and goes out and tries to get a peace agreement with the FARC. So Uribe is just, pissed off. The Supreme Court in Colombia is now starting to ask questions. Uribe gets put under house arrest for obstruction of justice. It's a whole shit show. Like we say in Colombia, Uribe is on a tiger right now that he can fall off at any minute. So this is all going on, and then the next election comes around. Uribe and the right is able to mobilize. So the peace agreement had a plebiscite first before it actually got concretized, and it lost. Like, people by like 50 to 49 voted against the peace agreement in Colombia, and there was a huge amount of propaganda. I mean, you had churches saying that Santos and the peace agreement with the FARC were trying to turn your children gay. Like all of these social issues are also involved in this as well, and they're the political correctness stuff. Like it's all in there, right? So that loses, and Santos is like, fuck it, and he signs the peace agreements anyways. And there's this whole process set up to integrate people who let down their arms. And Uribe then handpicks Duque as like his protege to be the next guy in line. And they run on basically tearing up the peace agreement into shreds. So Duque wins, but the left-wing challenger, Gustavo Petro, gets the most votes a left-winger has ever gotten in Colombian history. He is the one that wins the first round and goes to the runoff against him. And he loses, but it was a huge turnout for him that nobody expected. So they don't have the mandate they thought they did. And anyways, this is all to say that when they go back into government, two things happen. One, people that either demobilized from the FARC or, and I should say, social and environmental leaders across the country start to get murdered. And you got hundreds of murders every year happening since 2019 when the new government went into place. And two, they start to do this massive tax reform in the country, standard trickle-down economics shit. Just bunch of tax cuts, mostly to multinational and domestic mining companies and extractive industries. And then they start the process to bring fracking to Colombia too. I mean, it's just horrible shit. So this goes on for a year and a half, and then COVID hits. And the country's not prepared whatsoever for this. They offer no relief to the people of Colombia, but they also the relief is minimal, if any. Most people don't get anything. And they also do the quarantine, so people have to make a choice of either stay home and starve or risk, just imagine the pain we've lived through here in the United States, but multiplied by 100. You have all these people in the informal economy who can't quarantine and they need to work. You have this whole situation, and then Duque starts to, and his finance minister, they start to talk about how the deficit is too big because of all these tax cuts and COVID. And the finance minister makes an announcement that the Colombian government has a month and a half left of money. They're about to go bankrupt. And so then they say the only way to get out of this is to propose a hike on a sales tax hike on all basic goods. So that was the trigger that sets everything off. After years, and the reason I kind of gave that explanation at the beginning is like the country has already been paramilitarized. There have been a growing amount of scandals for human rights abuses, corruption. There have already been protests happening because of all these killings, extrajudicial killings that are happening. And then on top of that, they don't give pandemic relief, and then they raise the taxes on the working poor and the working class and the middle class. And everybody kind of unites together in saying this is fucking crazy. And people start to question whether giving into this law and order strongman, Uribe, who is basically controlling things still in the background, was a good idea. And so we have seen mass mobilizations across the country of people against this, against the very violent response that the government and the police has done. They've cut off the internet in some major cities. They're monitoring Facebook and Instagram posts. So, shit's getting pretty serious. And yeah, I mean, so Gustavo Petro, the person I mentioned, he's running again, and he is just way ahead in the polls. And he's organizing what he's calling, interestingly enough, a historic New Deal. I had a chance to speak with him in 2018, 2019. I went over to Bogota. We met in his office, and then I was part of an effort to bring him. He came to the U.S. to meet with congressional representatives at the Progressive Caucus Strategy Summit to talk about climate change and whatnot. And he really likes the idea of the Green New Deal and these efforts that are happening here by progressives. So he came up with this historic New Deal because Colombia never really had that social democratic experience that other countries in Latin America have had. And so he's basically bringing together liberals, social democrats, and the left all together to kind of say, we can't keep living like this. It's unsustainable. It's ludicrous. We need more employment. We need land reform, etc. And he's far ahead in the polls right now. So that's the situation. And he had actually proposed that the government lean on the Colombian central bank to give everybody a basic income during the pandemic and pay the subsidies or subsidize small and medium-sized businesses for their payroll so people could stay home. He proposed that, and people freaked out. People completely freaked out in the country and said we would become Venezuela like tomorrow, and the country would collapse. So that's the situation. That's what's going on right now. And the right is running out of options. So basically what they're doing now is just repression, conspiracy theories. They've taken on the whole kind of Trump paranoid conspiracy theory thing. Interestingly enough, Uribe has been talking about this theory that the molecular revolution, autonomous molecular revolution, something like that. Anyways, it comes from Deleuze and Guattari, and and he's off talking about how like all of these protests in the country are basically trying to lead some Deleuzian revolution in the country, and it's just nuts. And then the other one, of course, is that Maduro is behind everything in the background. So that's the situation in Colombia.
A bunch of things come to my mind when I'm thinking about this. One is most people in America probably don't know, but Colombia was one of the few countries in South America which the pink wave did not touch whatsoever, largely because of the paramilitarization that you described. But I also kind of a little bit blame the FARC because their methods got not just a kidnapping. I mean, killing peasants doesn't make you popular with peasants, generally speaking. You can go ask the Shining Path about that in Peru, but the still the backlash. I remember I was following it when it happened, because I've always had an interest in South American politics. But there's a few things I do want to bring up a little bit, though, about how what the candidate you're describing may be different than some of the other left candidates that we see emergent right now in places that have not been historically as leftist as Venezuela or Bolivia. And so let's contrast that first with a darling of some people on the American left, because I don't think they know anything about Mexico. Would you like to talk about AMLO a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's a fascinating case study, really. He had been running for president twice before he won. One of them was he contested the results. After years and years of rule in Mexico by one party, the PRI, the Conservative Party, was able to win, and they took power, and they really also, went all out on the war on drugs, and that turned Mexico, into a situation similar to Colombia in the 90s. Things just got really, really bad with violence and with all of this sort of stuff. So AMLO's there trying to run in behind the scenes, and then finally in this last election, he wins. He's able to put together a coalition, which in large part consists of social conservatives and religious conservatives around this narrative of austerity and like living low, minimalist living. My colleagues in the Left MMT world call this Franciscan politics. Just very, very austere, and that's how we're gonna fight corruption and it's money and greed that has corrupted everything, which is like, okay, greed, yeah, it's bad, but his response to it is really peculiar. So he wins, and almost immediately he starts to like cut a bunch of spending on universities, research grants, and he also starts to center his economic policy on developing more oil refineries as well, and expanding Mexico's fossil fuel production. He raffles out the presidential plane or jet, and so yeah, somebody wins that in a raffle or something like that, and with that money, pays for government functionaries and stuff like that. He kind of talks about reducing people in government's pay, and the people in Mexico, really buy into this, because there is this kind of sense of like, yeah, everybody's corrupt, politicians are corrupt, we should just like reduce their pay, and they should all live like us. So that's kind of the vision that AMLO is putting forward, and I mean, where is Mexico? There is really no way forward. There's nothing interesting is happening in Mexico. It's just a bunch of austerity, fossil fuel production, and the occasional kind of left rhetoric. But as a coherent vision to make Mexico a part of a wider internationalist left agenda, I don't see it happening there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I lived in Mexico for years, and I was there when the PAN, which was a right-wing party that was able to unseat the PRI for 2 election cycles. But the PAN was always kind of like the approved opposition of the PRI. People who don't understand the Party of the Institutional Revolution is a party that is ostensibly socialist, but is in name, it's part of the Socialist International, and yeah, has a very strange relationship to the cartels. The PAN actually even accelerated the PRI's already pretty bad drug war, which led to the massacres of the early aught teens, which I unfortunately lived through part of. And you know, I think Obrador, because he ran as a left opposition to the PRI in the prior elections, and for those who don't know Mexican history, his name is significant to the Mexican Revolution. He's from the family that kind of brought together the various left factions in a sort of liberal left center at the end of the Mexican Revolution. So that's, that's historically important. But I was reading Jacobin, and they were just ignoring both his policies and the fact that he was making weird peons to Trump that I think was not even about his own beliefs. I think it was about keeping the coalition that he's hobbled together in Mexico there, because the PRI can come back at any moment. I mean, they ruled the country as a single party, apparatus for almost a century. So everyone's got that in the back of their head. But so I completely agree with what you're saying, and I probably think it's a little worse than that. But the American response to that has just been kind of just dumb. They just see ostensible left-wing candidate in name, or historically has been a left-wing candidate. We don't understand why he's cooperating with Trump so much. We don't understand why he was waited for forever to acknowledge Joe Biden. We don't understand why he is doing all these weird hostility policies. In fact, we don't know, because we don't really finally follow Central American economic news. We just, maybe a little bit follow political news. Similarly, I want to pivot to another, this time to a South American country where you see something that might be compared to what's going on in Colombia, but seems to be actually very different in nature. And that is the situation in Peru. Also a country that's been relatively untouched by pink waves in the past. You do seem to have a socialist-ish candidate coming up, but people who watch closely are a little bit concerned.
Yes, I was about to bring that up as you were criticizing Jacobin's response to AMLO, because it seems like they and the Jacobin wing of DSA is making exactly the same mistake, except even taking it even further by, they're sending a delegation to Latin America, which, I'm like, all right, cool, fine, whatever. Could be good. But they're framing this whole big new step in DSA's work as, well, we're going to go protect the Venezuelans and the Maduro government, and then we're going to go and kind of support what's going on in Peru and in Castillo's campaign. And for those that don't know, I mean, Jacobin wrote an article where they even acknowledge this and then kind of push it aside. Is somebody that is openly anti-abortion, doesn't really support kind of gender politics and women's rights, etc. Has been openly xenophobic towards Venezuelans, and which is a problem in Latin America, where because of the kind of big exodus that's going on from Venezuelans going to Colombia and Peru, there's a lot of racism and people that think Venezuelans are just inherently bad people or whatnot. So he's taken these positions, kind of an ethno-nationalist, talks about Quechua supremacy, and which is kind of the background he has. Very concerning stuff, but seems to present himself as a leftist, and the American left just jumps all over this, and with no critical perspective whatsoever. So I think this is a huge problem. I think the left in the United States has really failed to develop any kind of nuance in their analyses, and it's just kind of become a gut instinct of anybody that calls himself either anti-imperialist or socialist is just kind of inherently great and somebody we have to get behind. and I think there's a lot of problems with that. I don't know if I used to consider myself a Marxist. I don't know if I do anymore. But even on Marxist terms, that none of that sounds very dialectical to me.
Yeah. Bad and lazy Marxism is becoming endemic because of its weird sort of populist gloss that it gets in of Jacobin. I won't say it's all of Jacobin. A large part of it is, and there's definitely movements that way in caucuses within the DSA. Interestingly, I talked to someone in Peru who was hesitantly sanguine, but only because of fears of the other candidate in Peru, which is Fujimori, and you know, Asian Latinx, ultra neoliberal woman, and a lot of the issues that I've heard that are driving this is Castillo has a lot of peasant support in Peru, partly because that tend to vote very conservative, but partly so somewhat similar to AMLO. The coalition that's holding that this candidate together is a little dicey. I mean, furthermore, I mean, the Quechua stuff and Quechua supremacy stuff is also interesting because I think a lot of from a lot of American binary notions of race, they don't know how to handle non Criollo, or well, they wouldn't even know what Criollo really was, but like non-white forms of supremacy when it gets into power. So they have all these various things going on, and I think it's not easy for an American to come to terms with it unless they know the history of not just Peru but South America in general, and the way their election systems works and the demographics. And there are times where I just wish they'd shut up. Like you don't have to have an opinion on all of this when in a situation like in Peru. I don't know that there's a good viable option. I also like that you mentioned the situation in Venezuela and how that and maybe this will bring it back to MMT and how these policies really matter. So MMTers always critique Venezuelans for pegging their currency to the dollar. Marxists either stand for them uncritically because that's what they do, because apparently not wanting the U.S. to intervene means you also must somehow support the government that's sitting, which is kind of weird. But two, and I think more importantly, even if they don't, they critique Venezuela for pegging for being a sole commodity production economy. What I think you hinted at, but didn't necessarily state, because you've mentioned both these things, is those things are directly related. So would you like to unpack how that affects Latin America a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you peg your currency, that may give you the capacity to use a particular commodity when it could bring dollars. And for Venezuela, that commodity was oil. And when prices were high, things were good in Venezuela. And I will acknowledge that Chavez did some good things early in his rule, and poverty went down in Venezuela at that time. A lot of social programs and services were expanded, all really good, important things. But as oil prices went down, they kind of found themselves in a shitstorm. I think it's also obviously important to acknowledge the coup attempts, the sabotaging, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just not going to help if you have that context to also what you do have agency over, You create policies so that when oil prices go down, you're just like kind of paralyzed, and you end up dependent on the very people that you're fighting. So that has been a very difficult situation for that reason. And in addition, I mean, like, so you have the sabotaging, the coup attempts, you have this bad policy decision, and you just have chronic corruption within the Venezuelan government too. I mean, a lot of people got incredibly rich throughout Chavez's tenure and later Maduro, because they were doing business and helping the government, and that oil money brought a shit ton of favors, and a lot of people got rich. So yeah, so that's the connection there, right? In Spanish we call it la izquierda petrolera, which Petro, no pun intended, Petro from Colombia, the leftist in Colombia, has been criticizing for a number of years now, basically explaining how a progressive or left movement in Colombia, or in Latin America at large, a new iteration of left-leaning socialist politics, cannot make the same mistake of being an izquierda petrolera or a petrol left. It needs to go beyond that, and Venezuela has not. Lula in Brazil and that movement found most of its weaknesses and trouble with Petrobras and that culture of corruption there as well. So it's a difficult political situation to build out this kind of movement. I mean, I'm not going to kind of say that like we're just going to be like a perfectly moralistic movement and not have to learn how to navigate these systems, but it provides a very, very serious obstacle to get beyond. So yeah, being able to mobilize investment to build out fossil alternatives to fossil fuel has to be prioritized on any new pink tide or left agenda.
I would pick up on that. My late colleague and kind of a friend, Michael Brooks, used to be a big Lula stan, and our one disagreement was I would point out that Lula didn't and probably couldn't do a lot of the reforms to deal with the corruption and particularly the oil industry, and that they would open him up if the Workers' Party ever lost power or they had any incompetent leadership, because there was also not subsequent legal reforms to legalize certain things that were being done and take care of politicians. Similar to Mexico, there's this urge to want to punish the politicians for being corrupt, and I get that, but punishing them by paying them less tends to encourage corruption. So you have this dynamic in a lot of places in Latin America, and in some ways, I've actually pointed out some of the reasons why we don't have in the U.S. is a lot of our corruption is just legal. And we have legal ways for this stuff to happen with lobbying. But it is a kind of consistent problem for the Latin American left. It's also something where I think the U.S. left is lost. I do want to address one comment that came up in our stream, and I want you to speak to it a little bit. That Latin American socialists tend to be more socially conservative than global North ones. When I talked to Camilo Gomez again in Peru, but urban Peru, he says that that's true, but it's not as true in the cities. That is a strong rural suburb city divide, actually similar to the U.S. Would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I mean, you would have to completely ignore the recent marches, movements for anti-femicide, women's rights, Argentina winning the right to an abortion. The LGBTQ movement across Latin America has been exponentially growing in the last decade. If you go to Bogota, I mean, this is a place where they've decriminalized sex work to a certain extent. There's a lot of problems still, but there have been advances made, and absolutely, the major cities across Latin America are not socially conservative, and there is growing resistance to this. So it's going to be a challenge and an obstacle to. I mean, also, like, I think, in Latin America, a lot of the rural parts tend to be more indigenous. In the peasants in Latin America tend to be more indigenous, and there is a tendency on the U.S. left to flatten indigeneity and just kind of assume that everybody is the same. And this is kind of part of a larger critique I think my colleagues and I have of Marxism and certain traditions that base their theory of kind of like on a fall. There's kind of like there was a utopia like thing back when we were in primitive communism, or we were living in indigenous communities and just kind of trading and living with nature and whatnot, and then money and capital came in and fucked everything up. I think it's a mistake to flatten indigeneity. There's a lot of dynamics at play. There are indigenous feminists, and in fact, the people that I've most communicated with in Colombia and the movement called MAS, which is a kind of a political coalition that will align itself with viable political parties in major elections. They're mainly led by women, by indigenous women, and I don't see them as socially conservative at all. So yeah, there are aspects of rural Latin America that absolutely are conservative, that have lineages to patriarchal structures that can be studied and analyzed as part of colonization itself and part of the trauma of that experience. The legacy of the Catholic Church in Latin America and in Colombia in particular has an incredibly brutal history. And for much of Colombia's history, like, they ran the country. And in some ways it started to get close to like a theocracy. So there's a lot of reasons why aspects of the Latin American left can be socially conservative, and we shouldn't just kind of accept that as some natural state. That is absolutely a site of struggle. There is a rural-urban divide similar to the US, and fighting and struggling for policies like land distribution, like just agriculture and food production, does not mean that we should just concede that rural peasants and farmers and indigenous people are just always going to be socially conservative, and that's kind of okay, and we can accept that, because it's not true. It's not something that all people accept who are part of those communities as well.
So we're going to start to wrap this up here, because I know you have other things you have to do today, and I thank you for your time. I just wanted to ask you, what do you think is the biggest takeaway that my audience should take from this discussion on policy, and then the particularities of things in the global South, and particularly in Latin America? I agree with the global South framework, but I'm also a little hesitant to like flatten even Latin America, but definitely like Latin America and Africa and South Asia and South Central Asia, because those dynamics are in some ways very, very different. But what are the biggest takeaways that you think my audience should come to, and maybe also, how could Marxists, social democrats work with MMTers, with our various framework differences, in a way that could make better policy, as opposed to just yelling at each other on the internet and doing nothing? That'll be the two major thoughts that I will have you close out on.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be a part of this conversation. A lot of this work is still iterative, and there are opportunities to continue to develop what an MMT framework would mean for various parts of the global South. And I think that's cool. That's one of the good things, the pros of using this framework. One of the big takeaways I think I would say is to not get in our own way by uncritically just accepting certain assumptions about the economy and categories in an economy as given, as opposed to kind of seeing the underlying legal and political structures that are quite malleable, and not just a fixed a fixed material logic that will just continue to flow like water or something like that. I mean, these are battles over design, over relational dimensions, and over decisions of what to do with governance. So that's one thing I would say. Another takeaway I think is really important is that across the global South, I think it's kind of universally important to understand that public employment and some form of a job guarantee, or as close to one as possible, is something that can do a tremendous amount of good, of material good for people in who are facing the constraints of austerity. Man, I mean, like you take a situation in I was watching one of these Vice documentaries about like Liberia, and in addition to like this absolutely horrendous history so wrapped up in American imperialism and arrogance and whatnot, a lot of countries facing this kind of depravity and abandonment, people are like, we want jobs, we want to do something, we want access to to production, and it just doesn't exist. And so I think there's a politics to abandonment here that often gets under theorized, where people are just kind of left to live with scraps. And there's really the potential here to mobilize that on the left. And I think that brings me to the question of like, what do we do across these different traditions besides yell at each other on Twitter? Maybe there's a time and place to do that, but I think also, coming to understand and respect the different premises that we're approaching with, where we may be able to put them aside, because at the end of the day, we all have a common vision of transforming the world, humanity, our relationships to one another, and to the environment and to other species, all of these sort of things, right? We want to suffer less. We want to create less destruction. We want to figure out what that means. So I think if we can get behind that, we can kind of respect and understand that, okay, MMTers are developing this framework with these premises that, don't see capital and materialist forces as the fundamental pillar of all political reality. All right, fine, right? When that can get dicey is when you hear people, like the first time I heard a conversation on the Michael Brooks show, rest in peace, about MMT. The response from the guests were just like, MMT has no theory of political economy, and then that's it, and they moved on. And it's, we always try to say, like, just because we don't have your theory of political economy doesn't mean we don't have a theory of political economy. So yeah, another takeaway is, curiosity over where people are coming from and getting their ideas from, doing the reading the literature that's out there, asking questions. Like Varn, you had skepticism about things and you approached it in good faith and asked questions, and we engaged. And at the end of the day, it seems as though we have much more in common than I think we have a difference. And I think that's really important. So yes, those are my takeaways. That's what I would say for your audience, and in particular, Left MMT and many of the MMTers who are part of a social movement, which I think in the U.S. that means the Green New Deal more than anything, and trying to make that as just and transformative as possible. We're we're not just trying to say that some technocratic fixes can change everything or can solve all our problems, but we're trying to emphasize that thinking about the world from a perspective that highlights finance, money, and these different institutions are part of political struggle themselves. That is, that, you know, in a way, they're the means of production, you know, and that's something we can all join together in struggle as well as other things.
All right, thank you, Andres Bernal, and you can find your work all over the place, actually, but most I would go check out Money on the Left collective website, look at their journal, listen to their podcast, Money on the Left and Superstructure. Superstructure, if you're a Marxist, can be a little triggering at time. Money on the Left is a little bit more ecumenical, but they're both good podcasts. I've learned a lot from both. They actually said nice things about Marx recently. So they don't even hate us all that much. So I would do that, and I'm going to let you go, Andres, and just do a little bit of business. So there we go. And just to quickly thank my Patreons who subscribe and make it where we can do the podcast version of this and get ideas like Andres's out to more people, because not everyone wants to sit in front of a YouTube video for an hour and a half. I'd like to thank Marcus Glanzer, Ryan Milliken, and Joaquim Chavez, and for being officers and giving us the maximum patronage that I take on without people just giving stupid amounts of money. And I'd like to thank Andres. I'd like to thank all the crew over there at Money on the Left, because we've been debating each other for a while, but I found the interactions very useful and helpful in understanding what is going on in a left context. And weirdly, I find that we often agree about a certain section of the DSA. I'm looking at you, weird populist section of the DSA. So we have that in common. And with that, have a good afternoon.